Why is the book of Hebrews such a mystery? That's what we're going to talk about today. Hi, this is Jill from the North Woods, talking about Bible topics, one small step at a time. In the Bible in small steps, we are about to start the book of Hebrews. And it is an interesting book, and we're going to go through it step by step about why there's so much mystery behind this particular book. We're going to understand why it was written, who it was written to, and what we know about it and what we don't know about it. So the book of Hebrews calls itself a word of exhortation, and that shows up in the last chapter, Hebrews 13. This is not a letter in the usual sense. It reads more like a sermon, a very long, carefully thought out theological sermon that is dense, written down, and was supposed to go to a specific group of people who really needed to hear it. Jewish Christians. The people who have grown up in the synagogue, revered Moses, knew the Old Testament inside and out, and had watched the high priest sacrifice year after year in the temple, and now have come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the person they've been waiting for since the very beginning. And now the pressure under Roman rule is harsher than it was before. There is, of course, always social ostracization because you became a Christian, you lose your job, your family, and the temptation to just go back and be Jewish was real. I could just go back and maybe, keep my faith to myself, or, just give this up. It's, when you're parting a community, you feel at least safe. I'm someone who became a Christian from being Jewish. And back on my grandmother's bookshelf, there was a book of awful things that happened to Jewish people. And it was a pretty big book. But the one thing in it that struck me the most is that one of the highest problems is if your progeny became a Christian. It went over on top of, they died. They, you name it. They went to jail. This was worse. And I know it. And you lose family members based on it. It's not even a matter of okay, well, we choose to disagree on this, but hey, we still love you. You lose everything. And that, is even worse at the time of that. You needed family for everything. So the book of Hebrews is written to a people standing at that particular crossroad in a much more dangerous time. The author's central argument can be summed up in one word that happens over and over again. Better. Jesus is better. Better than the angels who mediate the law at Sinai. Better than Moses, the figure who gave the old covenant. Better than the Levitical priesthood. Better than the sacrifices that are being made. Better than the early land. Anything that the land of Canaan could offer. The land of the Israeli people. The better than that could happen, that nothing can replace the promises of God, can fulfill the promises of God. And the substance of the covenant was in shadow, where the real old system was a pointer towards Jesus. Point. And the important thing to I guess, grasp when we read this is that the author isn't saying that Moses was wrong. He was saying that Moses was always pointing to Jesus. Everything, all the books were pointing to Jesus. The priests, the sacrifices, the tabernacle, all of it, pointing to Jesus. Right at him being the fulfillment of all of this. We are, I keep thinking that when I read this, why did we have a tabernacle? Why did we have sacrifices, priests with specific jewelry and those things? Because we are a people who like ritual, who like tradition. We identify with it. When we don't have it, we invent it. And God understands that about us. But instead of worshiping those things, we should be all looking towards God and towards Jesus, which this is all about. And now Jesus has come. You don't have to be in the shadows anymore. The darkness is gone. The sun has risen. The sun and, the light thing, right? So the other question comes in and this is the biggest question, is with themes of faith and justification, the obsolescence of the Mosaic law, the superiority of Christ over the old covenants. A lot of people think that sounds like Paul. That sounds like Paul in Romans. That sounds like Paul in Galatians and Colossians. There's a Timothy reference in there that mentions Timothy by name, and that Timothy was Paul's closest companion. So you think, oh, well, maybe this was Paul who wrote this particular piece. The Eastern church tradition, Origen specifically, Clement of Alexandria, Eusebius, all reported that the Eastern church widely accepted Hebrews as being written by Paul. They even acknowledged the style was unusual, though, that this tradition was old enough to carry some weight. The closing of this particular letter reads a lot like a Paul letter. Personal greeting, benediction, the mention of Timothy, the unusual sort of a sermon homily refers to sort of like a way that Paul framed things. There was even an imprisonment reference in there, hinting that the author was detained, which also fits Paul's situation. But then we look at the counter arguments to it, is that the style and vocabulary was the biggest problem. Even Origen himself said, only God knows who wrote it. The Greek of Hebrew is very polished, the most polished of all the New Testament. And it was more polished than anything else Paul wrote. So then we start getting different ideas about maybe who could have written it. Martin Luther thought that Apollos, remember Apollos? He was the guy that became a Christian. He was an educated man. He was very, like in a school of thought. He was very educated. And that he, remember, if you remember back, he was baptizing people and they said, hey, are you baptizing people in the name of Jesus or in the name, like the old baptism, like John the Baptist? And he's like, what? I didn't hear there was a new baptism. So Priscilla and Aquila go and educate him in Acts 18. He was eloquent, mighty with the scripture, worked closely with Paul. So that kind of fits in, that I think kind of makes it cool too. Someone who's very sophisticated, almost literary, who knows the Septuagint, that's the Greek Old Testament inside and out, and that the author places himself as someone, and this is why people say it's not Paul, as received the gospel secondhand, not as a direct eyewitness, which Paul could never say, never said it, and Apollos, that fits. I'm going with the Apollos thing. I think that one sounds the most intriguing, but like I said, in the end, none of us really know. We just know that it fits in beautifully with the message, with everything else that we're given, and it's a beautiful book to a people who really need this particular book. Some other scholars mention some other people, and some of them mention Barnabas, others Priscilla, or Luke the doctor. So, Luke we have writings of, and so we know Luke's style. But like I said, it's a mystery. And like I said, in the end, Origen in 230 said only God knows who wrote it, and I think that's true. That's the only thing we can do. So the dating of this book probably puts it into mid to late 60s AD, before the temple in Jerusalem, because the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. Burned to the ground, Jerusalem was sacked, people were hauled away. And how do we know that? Because the author writes about temple ritual as if they're still happening, present tense. If the temple had been destroyed, this would have been an argument. See, God is already judging the old system. It's all already gone. But instead, that's not what's being said here. The temple is still standing, and sacrifices are still happening at this point. And the audience is, like I said, house churches, house-to-house networks, probably somewhere in or near Rome, based on the greeting at the end, like second-generation believers, people who had endured real hardship in the early days of their faith, who had come to watch their leaders get imprisoned, lost property. They were probably tired, scared, and wondering, is all of this even worth it? And the context of it, matters in that because the warnings in Hebrew are real, they're not abstract. They are written to a people that the author loves. He's genuinely afraid of losing them, and not to paganism, but drifting back to something very familiar to them. Because again, Judaism was allowed at that point. Well, it depends on the point, but Nero persecuted the Jews heavily, but it was at a sanctioned religion. And so maybe they could just fade back into the woodwork and drift back to something that's familiar. They get their family back. They get their security back. And so that's probably why it happened. Now, one more thing before we close out this introduction is that throughout this whole book, Hebrews is this master class in what theologians called the law and the gospel. The law, and there's plenty of it in Hebrews, is a warning voice. It's telling us we're not living up. We're missing it. And it's a hard, clean, don't miss the urgency of this whole situation. It's serious. Unbelief is serious. Drifting is serious. Don't do what other wilderness generations have done. Then the gospel runs underneath the whole piece of it, because that same book is saying, how shall we, if we neglect something that's so great in salvation, how could we neglect that? How could we go away from what's going to give us salvation? We say we have a merciful and faithful high priest who's tempted in every way we are, tasted death, and sat down because the work had been finished. Jesus' work was complete. So there you have it. The law exposes our failings, like I said, a speed limit. 55, how fast am I going? The gospel heals. It shows you what it is that we need to do in order to come back to God. And it shows up chapter after chapter in this particular book, and we're going to go through this as we read it, like I said, in the Bible in small steps. That's our foundation, and we're going to jump into chapter 1. And the description that, of Jesus in the New Testament, this is such a beautiful description we're going to see. We're going to really enjoy this particular chapter. If you haven't heard the Bible in small steps, we're going through the Bible one small chapter at a time, so that we don't skip anything, we don't jump over everything, that we get a chance to read things a little bit more carefully. Again, I'm Jill from the North Woods. Please say anything if you have any comments, questions, if there's anything I could pray for you. You can put comments in the chat channel below here. You can email me at jill@startwithsmallsteps.com. Thank you so much, and have a great day.